The autumn sun was setting over Pine Ridge, an exclusive neighborhood where houses started at $1 million and the lawns looked like they belonged in magazines. Sarah Bennett sat in her modest Honda Civic, carefully documenting activity at 1542 Maple Avenue through her camera's telephoto lens. At 42 years old, she had spent the last 15 years building her reputation as one of the city's most reliable private investigators. Today's assignment was straightforward, gathering evidence for a corporate fraud case. Her client suspected their CFO of running a side business using company resources. Sarah had tracked his unusual patterns of weekend visits to this particular address, and today she was finally getting the photos she needed. The bright flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror made her sigh. She had been careful to park legally, knowing that fancy neighborhoods like this one tended to be extra watchful of suspicious vehicles. Sarah placed her hands on the steering wheel, already knowing how this would probably play out. Officer Mike Reynolds approached her window, his hand resting near his holster. "License and registration," he demanded, not even bothering with a greeting. Sarah noticed how his eyes narrowed as they took in her appearance. A black woman in casual clothes, sitting in a car that didn't match the neighborhood's usual Mercedes and BMWs. "Of course, officer," Sarah replied calmly, reaching slowly for her documents. "I'd also like to show you my private investigator's license. I'm here on official business." She kept her voice steady and professional, the way she had learned to do over years of similar encounters. Officer Reynolds barely glanced at her PI license. Had several reports of suspicious activity in this area. Someone watching houses. Could be casing them for robbery. His tone made it clear what he thought about her explanation. "Sir, I understand the concern, but I'm working a legitimate case. I have my case files right here, and you're welcome to verify my credentials with the state licensing board." Sarah pulled out her business card and official case documentation, maintaining her composure despite the familiar frustration building in her chest. The officer handed back her driver's license but kept her PI license, studying it with exaggerated skepticism. "This neighborhood's had some break-ins recently. Can't be too careful." He walked back to his patrol car, presumably to run her information. Sarah used the time to text her client, documenting the interruption for her case files. After 15 minutes, much longer than a routine check should take, Officer Reynolds returned with a citation book in hand. "I'm issuing you a citation for suspicious behavior and loitering," he announced, scribbling on the ticket. "The residents here pay good money to live in a safe neighborhood. We take their concerns seriously." "Officer, with all due respect, I'm a licensed professional conducting legal surveillance. There's no basis for this citation." Sarah kept her voice level, even as she recognized the futility of her protest. "You can explain that to the judge," he replied dismissively, thrusting the citation through her window. "Court date's on there. Move your vehicle out of the neighborhood now, or I'll have it towed." Sarah accepted the ticket, knowing that arguing further would only make things worse. As she started her car, she noticed several curtains twitching in nearby windows, residents watching the scene unfold from their million-dollar viewpoints. She couldn't help but wonder how many of them had called to report her suspicious presence. Driving away, Sarah added the citation to her case file. In 15 years of private investigation work, she had accumulated quite a collection of similar incidents. Each one reminded her that no matter how professional she was, no matter how many credentials she earned, some people would always see her through the lens of their prejudices first. But Sarah had learned to turn these encounters into advantages. She knew that tomorrow morning she would walk into court dressed in her sharpest suit, with all her documentation perfectly organized. She had learned long ago that the best response to prejudice was excellence, and she had excellence down to an art form. As she merged onto the highway, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. She had gotten the photos she needed before the interruption. Her client would be pleased, and that was what really mattered. The citation was just another day in the life of Sarah Bennett, PI, and she had long since learned how to handle those. The county courthouse stood tall and imposing in the morning sun. Sarah Bennett walked through the metal detectors at exactly 8:45 a.m., giving herself plenty of time before her 9:30 hearing. She wore a simple but professional black pantsuit, her natural hair neatly styled, and carried a well-worn leather briefcase containing all her documentation. The hallway outside Courtroom 3B was already crowded with people waiting for their traffic cases to be heard. Sarah noticed she was one of only 3 black people in the corridor, and the only one dressed in business attire. She took a seat on a wooden bench, reviewing her papers one last time while observing the steady stream of lawyers and court officials hurrying past. At 9:25, the bailiff opened the heavy wooden doors. "All rise for the Honorable Judge William Hawthorne," he announced as everyone filed into the courtroom. Sarah chose a seat in the middle row, watching as a stern-faced white man in his 60s took his place at the bench. Judge Hawthorne had a reputation in the legal community. 20 years on the bench had earned him a name for being strict, traditional, and somewhat old-fashioned in his views. His silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses added to his image of authority. First case, the clerk called out after the morning formalities. Citation number 47,829, suspicious behavior and loitering. Sarah stood, straightening her jacket as she walked to the podium. Judge Hawthorne glanced at the citation, then at Sarah, his expression already settling into one of disapproval. "State your name for the record," he said, his tone clipped and impatient. "Sarah Bennett, Your Honor." Her voice was clear and confident. "I'd like to explain the circumstances of this citation. I'm a licensed private investigator, and I was—" "Ms. Bennett," Judge Hawthorne interrupted, peering over his glasses. "I see here this is your 3rd citation this year for suspicious behavior. Do you make a habit of lurking in residential neighborhoods?" Sarah kept her composure, though her heart rate quickened at the unfair characterization. "Your Honor, if I may explain, the previous citations were all dismissed when I presented my credentials. I was conducting legal surveillance as part of an ongoing investigation." "Miss Bennett," the judge cut her off again, his voice carrying a hint of condescension. "This court has heard every excuse imaginable. Pine Ridge is an upscale neighborhood with ongoing concerns about security. The responding officer noted you were unable to provide a satisfactory explanation for your presence." Sarah opened her briefcase, pulling out her PI license and case documentation. "Your Honor, I have my credentials right here, along with the case files proving I was there on legitimate business. My client can verify." "That won't be necessary." Judge Hawthorne waved his hand dismissively. "The issue here isn't your claimed profession, Ms. Bennett. It's about respecting private communities and their right to security. The residents of Pine Ridge pay considerable property taxes, and they have a right to feel safe in their neighborhood." Sarah felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach, the same one she got every time someone in authority refused to see past their preconceptions. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I was parked legally, conducting legitimate business, and provided proper identification to the officer." Judge Hawthorne's expression hardened. "Your attitude isn't helping your case, Ms. Bennett. This court takes community safety seriously." He shuffled some papers on his bench, barely glancing at Sarah's outstretched documentation. "I'm imposing a fine of $750 to be paid within 30 days. Let this serve as a reminder to conduct your business in more appropriate locations." Sarah stood perfectly still, her hands still holding out her unexamined credentials. Around her, she could hear the subtle murmur of other people waiting for their cases. The injustice of the moment sat heavy in her chest, but years of experience had taught her to maintain her professional demeanor. "Yes, Your Honor," she said quietly, gathering her documents. As she turned to leave the podium, she noticed the judge had already looked away, calling for the next case. Sarah walked back to her seat, her back straight and her head held high, even as her mind raced with thoughts of the meeting she had scheduled for later that day, a meeting that Judge Hawthorne didn't yet know about. Sometimes, she reminded herself, justice took unexpected paths, and Sarah Bennett had learned long ago that patience was often the best response to prejudice. Sarah Bennett sat in her car in the courthouse parking lot, staring at the pink copy of her fine ticket. The amount $750 seemed to mock her, not because she couldn't afford it, but because of what it represented. She pulled out her phone and dialed her assistant's number. "Marcus, clear my morning appointments. Something's come up that needs handling." She started her car, her mind already planning her next steps. "And send me Judge William Hawthorne's complete public record. Every case he's handled in the last 5 years involving citations like mine." Back at her office, Sarah walked past the polished brass plaque reading Bennett Investigations, Discretion and Excellence since 2009. Her space wasn't fancy, but it was professional, 2 rooms in a downtown office building, with a small waiting area where Marcus sat managing calls and paperwork. "Got those records you wanted," Marcus said, looking up from his computer. "And Mrs. Richardson called about her husband's case, says she needs an update." Sarah nodded, taking the stack of printed papers. "Tell Mrs. Richardson her case is progressing exactly as planned. I'll have photos for her by the end of the week." She paused at her office door. "Any word from Stevens and Associates about this afternoon?" They confirmed, 2 p.m. sharp. Marcus gave her a knowing look. "Judge Hawthorne's daughter's case, right? Want me to pull those surveillance photos from last week?" "Already done." Sarah patted her briefcase. "Sometimes, Marcus, timing is everything." She closed her office door and spread the courthouse records across her desk. For the next 3 hours, Sarah meticulously reviewed every case Judge Hawthorne had handled involving loitering or suspicious behavior citations. She created a spreadsheet, noting the defendant's race, the fine amount, and whether credentials or evidence were properly reviewed. The pattern that emerged wasn't surprising, but it was clear and troubling. Around noon, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from the court clerk's office. "Payment reminder for citation number 47,829. Fine amount, $750. Due within 30 days. She set the phone aside and continued her research. At 1:30, Sarah changed into a fresh suit, charcoal gray, perfectly tailored. She checked her appearance in the small office mirror, adjusting her pearl earrings. These were the same earrings she'd worn while testifying in federal court last month, helping to crack a major insurance fraud case. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Marcus," she called out while gathering her materials. "Remember that traffic camera footage we pulled last week? Add it to the Richardson file, and hold all calls until I get back from Stevens and Associates." Her assistant grinned. "Already done. Good luck with the judge's daughter's case. Think he'll recognize you?" "Oh, I'm counting on it." Sarah checked her watch. 1:45 p.m. Sometimes people need a little shock to see what's right in front of them. As she drove to the law office, Sarah thought about the fine sitting unpaid on her desk. $750 that assumed she was somewhere she didn't belong. $750 that said her credentials didn't matter, her professionalism didn't count, and her word wasn't worth hearing. But Sarah Bennett hadn't built one of the city's most respected private investigation firms by letting other people's assumptions stop her. She learned to turn prejudice into opportunity, to let people's underestimation become her advantage. Pulling into the parking lot of Stevens and Associates, one of the city's top law firms, Sarah checked her files one last time. Inside her briefcase were surveillance photos of Judge Hawthorne's daughter's husband. Photos showing exactly why the judge's daughter needed a good divorce lawyer. Photos that Sarah had taken while parked in another wealthy neighborhood, doing exactly what she'd been fined for yesterday. As she walked toward the building's entrance, Sarah's phone buzzed with another payment reminder for the fine. She smiled slightly, knowing that by this time tomorrow, that fine would be the least of Judge Hawthorne's concerns. Sometimes, she thought, justice worked in unexpected ways, and Sarah Bennett had always been very good at the unexpected. Judge William Hawthorne hurried through the glass doors of Stevens and Associates at 1:55 p.m. His daughter's divorce case had been keeping him awake at night, and he'd pulled strings to get her the best legal help in the city. The receptionist greeted him with a practiced smile. "Judge Hawthorne, welcome. Mr. Stevens is waiting for you in the conference room. He's just finishing up with the private investigator they hired for your daughter's case." The judge nodded, straightening his tie as he walked down the hallway. He'd insisted on meeting this investigator personally. His daughter Catherine needed solid evidence to ensure she got full custody of the children. The sound of familiar voices drifted from the conference room. "Your work on this case is exceptional, Ms. Bennett," James Stevens was saying as the judge pushed open the door. "The documentation is absolutely thorough, and these surveillance photos." Judge Hawthorne froze in the doorway. Sitting at the conference table, dressed in an impeccable charcoal gray suit, was the same woman he'd fined that morning. Sarah Bennett turned slowly in her chair to face him, her expression perfectly professional. "Good afternoon, Your Honor," she said calmly. "I believe we met earlier today under less favorable circumstances." James Stevens looked between them, confused. "Judge Hawthorne, I see you've already met Ms. Bennett." She's one of the most respected private investigators in the city. Her evidence gathering is absolutely bulletproof. She just showed me some remarkable photographs of your son-in-law's activities. The judge remained frozen, his face slowly reddening as the reality of the situation sank in. The woman he dismissed that morning, the one whose credentials he refused to even look at, was the same investigator he'd been assured was the best in the business. Sarah opened her briefcase, removing a stack of photographs. Perhaps, Your Honor, you'd like to review my credentials now, along with the evidence I've gathered for your daughter's case. Her voice remained steady, professional, but there was a glint in her eye that spoke volumes. Judge Hawthorne slowly sank into a chair, his earlier arrogance deflating visibly. Miss Bennett, that is, this morning's situation was unfortunately not an isolated incident. Sarah finished for him, laying out the surveillance photos one by one. But right now, let's focus on your daughter's case. These photos show your son-in-law entering various properties with significant amounts of cash. My investigation suggests he's been hiding assets in preparation for the divorce. James Stevens nodded enthusiastically. Miss Bennett's work is remarkable. She managed to document everything without ever being noticed. True professional expertise. The judge stared at the photos, each one crystal clear, each one taken from a parked car in an upscale neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on him. You took these while conducting surveillance? Yes, Your Honor. Much like I was doing when I received that citation yesterday. Sarah's voice remained neutral as she continued presenting evidence. I have transaction records, time-stamped photos, and witness statements, all gathered through completely legal surveillance methods. The conference room fell silent except for the soft sound of Sarah laying out more documentation. Judge Hawthorne looked at the evidence, then at Sarah, then back at the evidence. The woman he fined for lurking in rich neighborhoods had just handed him exactly what he needed to protect his daughter's interests. Miss Bennett, he finally said, his voice much quieter than it had been in court, about this morning. Your Honor. Sarah interrupted smoothly, right now, your daughter's case is what matters. We can discuss this morning's incident after we've reviewed all the evidence I've gathered. I believe ensuring your daughter's future is more important than dwelling on past misunderstandings. The judge nodded slowly, acutely aware of how his courtroom prejudice was now colliding with his personal need for this woman's professional expertise. As Sarah began explaining the evidence in detail, he found himself hanging on every word, forced to acknowledge that the same surveillance work he condemned that morning might now save his daughter's future. Sometimes, he realized, justice had a way of teaching its own lessons. After the meeting at Stevens and Associates ended, Judge Hawthorne lingered in the conference room. Sarah Bennett was carefully organizing her files, her movements deliberate and unhurried. James Stevens had left them alone, sensing the unspoken tension in the air. Miss Bennett, the judge began, his earlier authority noticeably diminished. Would you have time for a private word? Sarah closed her briefcase with a soft click. Of course, Your Honor. Though I should remind you that I still have an unpaid fine of $750 due within 30 days. Her voice remained professional, but there was a slight edge to her words. The judge winced visibly. About that. I clearly made some assumptions this morning that were inappropriate. Assumptions? Sarah turned to face him fully. You mean like assuming I couldn't possibly have a legitimate reason to be in Pine Ridge? Or assuming my credentials weren't worth examining? Or perhaps assuming that someone who looks like me must be up to no good in a wealthy neighborhood? Her words hung in the air between them. Judge Hawthorne shifted uncomfortably in his expensive leather chair. I realize now that I acted hastily this morning. If you'd like to appeal the fine. Your Honor, Sarah interrupted, her calm demeanor unchanged. This isn't about $750. I earned that much in the 2 hours I spent photographing your son-in-law's suspicious activities. She pulled out a folder from her briefcase. This is about patterns. She opened the folder, revealing the spreadsheet she'd compiled earlier. In the past 5 years, you've handled 127 cases involving suspicious behavior or loitering citations. Would you like to know what I found when I analyzed those cases? The judge's face paled slightly, but he nodded. Of those cases, 82 involved people of color. The average fine for white defendants was $150. For defendants of color, it was $580. In cases where defendants presented professional credentials, white defendants had their cases dismissed 89% of the time. For defendants of color, that dismissal rate was 17%. Sarah laid the statistics on the table between them. Numbers don't lie, Your Honor. They tell a story of consistent bias in your courtroom. The same bias that led you to find me this morning without even glancing at my PI license. Judge Hawthorne stared at the spreadsheet, his hands trembling slightly. You compiled all this today. Research is what I do, Your Honor. Just like surveillance. Just like gathering evidence. Just like all the other professional activities you assumed I couldn't possibly be doing legally. Sarah's voice remained steady, but her eyes held years of accumulated frustration. The judge looked up at her, really seeing her for the first time. The pearl earrings, the perfectly tailored suit, the organized files, all the marks of professionalism he blindly ignored that morning. Miss Bennett, I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Not just for this morning, but for, well, it seems for quite a pattern of behavior I hadn't recognized in myself. Sarah nodded slowly. Recognition is the first step, Your Honor, but it can't be the last. Not when your decisions affect real people's lives every day. She stood up, gathering her materials. Your daughter's case is solid. The evidence I gathered will likely ensure she gets full custody. I did that job professionally and legally, parking in expensive neighborhoods, watching houses, taking photos, all the things you fined me for this morning. The judge stood as well, looking considerably older than he had that morning in court. What happens now, Ms. Bennett? Sarah picked up her briefcase. Now, I continue doing my job with excellence, as I've always done. As for you... She paused at the door. Well, that's up to you, Your Honor. The evidence is clear. The question is, what will you do with it? She left him standing there in the conference room, surrounded by proof of both his biases and her competence. Through the window, he could see her walking to her car, the same car he deemed suspicious that morning, the same car she used to gather evidence that would save his daughter's future. Sometimes, he realized, the most powerful lessons came from the most unexpected teachers. Judge William Hawthorne couldn't sleep that night. He sat in his home office at 2 a.m., surrounded by case files he pulled from his records. Sarah Bennett's spreadsheet lay on his desk, the numbers seeming to glow in the dim lamplight. For the first time in his 20 years on the bench, he was questioning every decision he'd ever made. His daughter Catherine had called earlier, excited about the evidence Sarah had gathered. Dad, Ms. Bennett is amazing. She got photos of Robert hiding money at his brother's house. She even found out about his secret bank account. The pride in Catherine's voice when talking about Sarah made his stomach twist. The same woman he'd dismissed and fined that morning had spent weeks building an airtight case to protect his daughter. The irony felt like a physical weight on his shoulders. He picked up another case file from last month. A young black man charged with suspicious behavior while delivering packages in an upscale neighborhood. The judge had fined him $600, despite the man showing his delivery company ID. With trembling hands, he added this case to his growing pile of similar incidents. How many careers did I damage? He whispered to his empty office. How many lives did I make harder because I couldn't see past my own prejudices? His gaze fell on a photo on his desk, himself at his judicial swearing-in ceremony 20 years ago. He remembered his oath, to administer justice fairly, without prejudice or bias. Had he ever truly lived up to those words? Around 3 a.m., he opened his laptop and began searching news archives. Sarah Bennett's name appeared in numerous articles. Local PI breaks major fraud case. Bennett Investigations helps police solve cold case. Top private investigator testifies in federal court. Each story painted a picture of a consummate professional, respected by law enforcement and feared by criminals. The same professional he treated like a suspicious character that morning. Judge Hawthorne got up and walked to his window, looking out at his own wealthy neighborhood. How many times had he praised his community's vigilance against suspicious people? How many times had he justified harsh fines in the name of maintaining community standards? His phone buzzed, a text from Catherine. Dad, just reviewed more of Ms. Bennett's evidence with the lawyer. We're going to win this. She even recorded Robert bragging about hiding assets. She's incredible. The judge set down his phone, remembering Sarah's calm demeanor in the conference room. She could have been angry, could have threatened to expose his bias to the media. Instead, she'd simply presented facts, maintaining her professionalism even while confronting him with evidence of his prejudice. He returned to his desk and began writing. First, a formal letter requesting the dismissal of Sarah's fine. Then, a longer document, a review of his own judicial conduct over the past 5 years. As the sun began to rise, he was still writing, documenting every instance where his biases might have influenced his decisions. Around 6 a.m., his courthouse clerk arrived early as usual, surprised to find the judge already in his chambers. "Janet," he said, looking up with tired eyes, "I need you to pull every case file we have involving suspicious behavior or loitering citations from the past 5 years. And contact the public defender's office. I want to review any cases where credentials or professional documentation might have been inadequately considered." The clerk looked startled. "All of them, Your Honor? That could be hundreds of cases." "Yes, all of them." He straightened his shoulders. "It's time I took a hard look at some patterns in my courtroom." As Janet left to begin the massive task, Judge Hawthorne picked up Sarah's business card from his desk. He owed her more than just an apology. He owed her a change, not just in words, but in actions. More importantly, he owed that change to every person who would ever stand in his courtroom. Sometimes, he realized, the hardest judgments were the ones you had to pass on yourself. The next morning, courtroom 3B was unusually full. Word had spread quickly through the courthouse that Judge Hawthorne had called for a special session. Sarah Bennett sat in the back row, watching as the judge entered the courtroom. She noticed immediately that something was different about his demeanor. "Before we begin today's regular cases," Judge Hawthorne announced, his voice carrying clear authority, but with a new note of humility, "I have an important matter to address." He looked directly at Sarah, then surveyed the entire courtroom. "Yesterday, in this courtroom, I made a serious error in judgment. I fined a highly qualified professional without properly reviewing her credentials. More importantly, I've discovered this was not an isolated incident, but part of a troubling pattern in my courtroom." A murmur ran through the audience. The court reporter's fingers paused briefly over her keyboard, and even the bailiff looked surprised. "I've spent the night reviewing my cases from the past 5 years," the judge continued. "The evidence shows clear disparities in how I've handled cases based on race and appearance. This is unacceptable for any judge, and it stops today." He lifted a stack of papers from his bench. "I'm ordering a review of all suspicious behavior and loitering citations issued in my courtroom over the past 5 years. Cases where credentials or professional documentation were not properly considered will be reopened." Sarah sat straighter in her seat, watching as several other people of color in the courtroom exchanged glances. The judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I'm implementing new procedures in this courtroom. All credentials presented will be thoroughly reviewed and entered into the record. All testimony will be heard in full. And most importantly, I will be requiring implicit bias training for myself and all court staff." He turned his attention directly to Sarah. "Miss Bennett, would you please approach the bench?" Sarah walked forward, aware of all eyes following her. She stood at the podium, professional as always in her navy suit. "Yesterday, I fined you $750 without reviewing your private investigator's license or hearing your explanation. That fine is hereby dismissed." He paused, looking her in the eye. "But more than that, I owe you a public apology. Your work as a private investigator is exemplary, and your professionalism in handling my bias was educational." Sarah nodded, maintaining her composure. "Thank you, Your Honor." "Miss Bennett, I have a request," the judge continued. "Would you be willing to assist in training sessions for our court staff? Your perspective as both a professional investigator and someone who has experienced systemic bias would be invaluable." For the first time that morning, Sarah smiled slightly. "I would be honored, Your Honor. Though my usual consulting fee applies." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Judge Hawthorne actually smiled. "Of course, we'll pay your standard rate." As Sarah returned to her seat, the judge addressed the courtroom again. "Justice must be truly blind, not selectively blind. Not blind to evidence while seeing race. Not blind to credentials while seeing skin color. From today forward, this courtroom will strive to deliver real justice, equal justice, to all who enter." The regular court session began, but something had shifted in courtroom 3B. The judge listened more carefully to each case. He asked questions he hadn't asked before. He looked at people, really looked at them, instead of just their citations. After the session, as people filed out, Sarah felt her phone buzz. It was a text from Marcus. "How'd it go?" She typed back. "Better than expected. Change starts with accountability." As she walked to her car, Sarah reflected on the morning's events. One case, one confrontation, one moment of revelation had sparked what looked like real change, but she knew the real work was just beginning. True justice, like good investigation work, required constant vigilance and attention to detail. And Sarah Bennett would be watching, making sure this change wasn't just words in a courtroom, but actions that made a difference in people's lives. 3 months had passed since the day Sarah Bennett walked into Judge Hawthorne's courtroom. The changes in courtroom 3B were obvious to everyone who entered. Gone were the rushed judgments and dismissive attitudes. In their place was a new atmosphere of careful consideration and respect. Sarah sat in on one of these reform sessions, observing from the back row. A young black woman stood at the podium, explaining that she had been photographing houses for her real estate job when someone reported her as suspicious. "Please show the court your credentials," Judge Hawthorne said kindly. He carefully reviewed her real estate license and work orders, then looked at the responding officer. "And was Ms. Thompson given an opportunity to present these documents during the incident?" The changes weren't just in his courtroom. Sarah's consulting work with the court staff had led to new training programs and procedures. The court clerks now had a checklist for processing credentials. The bailiffs had received training on respectful interaction. Even the parking attendants had been included in discussions about profiling and bias. Judge Hawthorne's daughter Catherine had won her divorce case, thanks largely to Sarah's evidence. She had full custody of her children and a fair settlement, secured by the photos and recordings Sarah had gathered while conducting the same kind of surveillance that had once earned her a fine. "Miss Bennett," the judge called out after the session ended, "do you have a moment?" Sarah approached the bench, noting how different it felt from that first morning. "Of course, Your Honor. I wanted to share something with you." He handed her a report. "We've completed the review of past cases. Out of 127 reviewed citations, 89 have been dismissed with refunds issued. The statistical disparities you identified, well, they've been corrected." Sarah scanned the document, noting the detailed breakdown of the cases. "And the new procedures?" "Working better than expected," the judge smiled slightly. "Citations for suspicious behavior are down 70%. Turns out when officers have to document their reasons clearly and suspects get to present their credentials, many of these situations resolve themselves without court involvement." Just then, Marcus appeared at the courtroom door. "Sorry to interrupt, but Sarah, we've got that surveillance job in Pine Ridge starting in an hour." "Pine Ridge?" The judge raised an eyebrow. "The same neighborhood as—" "The same," Sarah confirmed. "Though this time I have this." She pulled out a new document, an official letter from the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association acknowledging her firm's right to conduct legitimate surveillance in the neighborhood. "My suggestion," the judge noted. "After what happened with you, I spoke to some friends on the association board, suggested they might want to establish clear procedures for legitimate professional activities." Sarah nodded appreciatively. "Changes big and small, Your Honor. They all matter." As she turned to leave, the judge called after her. "Miss Bennett, the monthly training session for new court staff is next week. Will you be there?" "Wouldn't miss it," Sarah replied. "Though my consulting rates have gone up." There was a twinkle in her eye as she said it. The judge chuckled. "Worth every penny, Miss Bennett. Worth every penny." Outside the courthouse, Sarah and Marcus walked to her car, the same Honda Civic that had once been deemed suspicious. "You know," Marcus said, checking their surveillance equipment, "I heard 3 other courthouses in the state are adopting Judge Hawthorne's new procedures. They're calling it the Bennett Protocol." Sarah smiled as she started the car. "One case at a time, Marcus. One change at a time." As they drove toward Pine Ridge, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in 3 months. The same streets that had once brought her a citation now welcomed her as a professional. The same judge who had once dismissed her now sought her expertise. But most importantly, other people like her, professionals who happened to be black, who happened to work in wealthy neighborhoods, who happened to not fit someone's idea of what they should be, would face fewer barriers, fewer assumptions, fewer automatic judgments. Sometimes justice worked in unexpected ways, and sometimes, Sarah thought as she parked her car in Pine Ridge, the best kind of change started with one person being exactly who they were, exactly where they weren't expected to be.